Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Deborah Uber, the Education Coordinator for the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center. We're excited to have you all here today, and we're very pleased to bring you our newest webinar, 9 Steps to Long-Term Success in Parenting Through Embryo Adoption. Now, before we get started today, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using the questions you submit through the Q&A feature. You may submit your questions at any time during the session, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, simply click on the Q&A panel in the lower right-hand portion of the screen, type your question into the dialog box, and click the Send button. If you happen to be in the full screen view, you can click on the question mark icon on the toolbar in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. This will open the Q&A panel on your screen only. When you submit your question, it will be visible to all of the panelists, but not visible to other attendees. And we do expect the presentation to last approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes for Q&A. We will distribute a copy of today's presentation and a comprehensive list of answers to all questions submitted today during the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please contact WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. Just as a reminder, this presentation is being recorded, so I will go ahead and introduce our lovely presenter. Our presenter today is Ms. Lori Holden. Lori is an active blogger and the author of The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption, which we have a slide about later. This is a great tool for both agencies and families. Lori also writes for the Huffington Post and is a regular columnist for the Denver Post MileHighMamas.com. Parenting Magazine has called her blog a must-read, and Adoptive Families Magazine has named her a top blogger. She is an active reviewer for Path to Parenthood, and she is frequently called upon to be a guest for radio and television as well as for our webinars. Most importantly, she is a fantastic mother to 2 children that were adopted as infants and are now 14 and 16. Lori has helped us with several fantastic webinars. We've always loved having her here, so we're no less excited to have her present for this one. Lori, thanks so much for joining us. I will go ahead and let you take it from here.
Wonderful, Deb. Thank you so much for that introduction. I am really impressed that everybody showed up this morning to dedicate some time and invest yourselves in the long-term active parenting. When I deliver workshops on this, I sometimes start out by asking the audience, is the wedding the end of the story, the happily ever after? And most of them realize that it's not. It's the ending of one story, sure, but it's the beginning of the marriage. And that's kind of what we're talking about in this session today. Is we're going to be talking about the metaphorical marriage, the long-term things that go on as once you've filled the crib. So first of all, I'd like you to throw out the typical labels that we use to describe contact in adoption scenarios, including embryo adoption. And those would be, and I bet you're familiar with, if not a little vague about these would be closed, semi-closed, semi-open, and open. These describe a level or an amount or some way of measuring something we call contact, when really what we should be paying attention to is something else. So in the coming 45 minutes, I am not going to tell you that you need to have contact with your child's other parents. Contact invites in complexity. People are complex. Much of the time, I don't even know why I do what I do. There are layers and layers and layers to me. So people are complex, and relationships are super complex when you add in another person. And relationships over time are super duper complex. So if you're inviting in all that complexity through contact, you better have ways to deal with it. And that's what we're here to talk about today. This is where openness comes in. And by virtue of you tuning in here today, I'd venture to say that you already have a sense of that openness, dealing with what is and aiding your child in doing the same. Because openness is a way for you to cultivate an enduring and trusting and strong and intimate connection with your child over the years. It starts wherever you are in your journey, for really, it starts within you. So whether or not your baby has come into your life yet, or if that baby has grown into a toddler or a school-age child or a teenager or a young adult, we're going to spend the rest of this session focusing on openness as the key to your long-term parenting success. So while I'm not going to tell you you must have contact with your child's other parents, I am going to tell you that to maximize your chances of raising a healthy, well-functioning person who is in a good position to heal that split between biology and biography, and who wants you along on their journey in building their identity, you are going to need to cultivate openness between you and your son or daughter about matters including their origin story. So this is the premise of my book, The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption. The premise is adoption creates a split between a person's biology, that's the DNA we're born with, and their biography. It's a life that's written by those we call family. And openness is a way to help heal that split. So when I talk with people about this, people kind of come into adoption with this idea of a spectrum where we have closed on one end and open on one end, and those semi-open and semi-closed somewhere in between. But what's not clear here is, what are we measuring? Are we measuring frequency of contact? Are we measuring type of contact? Are we measuring the meaningfulness of the contact? I find this construct to be a little bit lacking because contact is measuring the wrong thing, I believe, or at least it's not the only thing. And contact is not the same as openness. For one thing, contact depends on other people to be around. You can only do so much, and then it's up to the others in your arrangement to be there or not. But openness is something you have full control over. That's something that happens within you. Also, contact is what happens between the adults, with the child kind of getting the byproduct of that. But as I said before, openness is an inside job that happens within you and between you and your child. So how do I define openness? I define openness, I've come to define this as I've been raising my kids for a long time, as dealing in what is. So the opposite of openness, closedness, would be when we don't deal with what is, or when we deal in fantasy, or when we don't deal at all and we just kind of stuff things down and don't deal. So if we take both of these measures, contact and openness, what this does is this pops our adoption spectrum up into an adoption grid. And this gives us 4 different quadrants on which we can kind of plot where we'd like to be parenting, and something to use as our GPS and what we're aiming for along the way if we sometimes get lost along the way and we aren't exactly doing what we had aimed for, kind of like recalculating on a GPS system. So in this grid, we still have the degree of contact, whatever that means, along the horizontal axis, but we've added in some elevation on here, the degree of open-heartedness or openness. And that's just a fancy way of saying mindfulness, of kind of knowing what's going on within you and maybe even what's going on with your child. So let's take a quick tour through these 4 quadrants. If we start with the first quadrant in the lower left corner, this looks a lot like a traditional closed adoption, something that you might have seen in the 60s or 70s or 80s or maybe even 90s, where there's low contact, maybe not even having identifying information, and low openness. Because back in these days, a lot of times people were counseled to act as if you'd given birth to this child, as if nothing spectacular or out of the ordinary had happened. And so people were not really coached and counseled on dealing with what is. If we move over to the right into box 2, we're going to add in some contact. But we're going to keep the openness out of the equation. So maybe in this situation, we are having parents having contact with their child's other parents through phone calls or pictures or even visits. But if they're saying things like, well, we're willing to send pictures, or we're abiding by our agreement, what you're getting here is they're following kind of the law, but not necessarily the spirit of the law. And it's kind of this connection, this true relationship piece that's missing. And the parents here maybe are still not ready to deal with some of the harder parts of things because they've got triggers and buttons going on inside them. We're going to explore those later if that's not quite clear yet. If we switch things up here and move to the upper left corner, we're going to remove contact but allow for openness. Now in this box, this is what often international adoptions look like because birth parents just simply are not available, maybe even not known. Or foster situations sometimes are in this box when contact with birth parents is not wise. Maybe they're just not in a safe place right now. Or in my situation, where sometimes of the 4 birth parents in our constellation, not all of them are in. Sometimes they opt out and they just remove themselves for a while. But in this box, the parents are still parenting with openness. They're still tuning in to what's going on within them, and they're still really cultivating this channel between them and their child. And if we go one more, box 4 is where we have high contact and high openness. And this would look a lot like any other extended family relationship where we get together, we do stuff, we're family, we may not always like them, but we're connected by family, so we make it work. This would be in-law relationships, cousins, extended family. I want to make it clear that box 4 is not the best box. Box 4 is not better than box 3. And box 2 is not better than box 1. What's important on this grid is the elevation, not the degree of left or right, because that's not all you. But the degree that you parent with openness, that's what you can control, and that's where the benefits to the child come in. So now that we've laid some groundwork, I'd like to start going over the 9 things you need to know in order to thrive as a parent and child through embryo adoption over the long term. So one of the first things to understand, and this will sound like a big duh, is that parenting will stretch you, just regular parenting. Parenting is not always a cakewalk, and parenting via embryo adoption adds another element of complication. But just as you're going to figure out how to deal with toilet training and choosing schools and doing homework and developing good habits and body image and dealing with middle school drama and driving and having the drugs and sex and alcohol talks and all those other quintessential and scary parenting moments, you will need to find ways to help your child deal with the question of who am I over the years. Just as you're going to do those other things, you're going to go figure out how to do this. You trust that you're going to figure out the regular parenting things, and you're going to figure this out too. This means simply to deal in truth. Over time, deliver the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Be prepared always to deal in what is. That's my definition of openness, as I said. Understand that delivering truth will pay you dividends in receiving your child's trust. And you want that. You want to be trusted. You want to be invited along on the journey as they grow up and they take over the reins of their own life. Number 2 is to tune into yourself and make doing so a practice. So this requires you to detect and resolve any of your own triggers that you may uncover about telling your child's origin story. We were counseled when we brought our daughter home from the hospital to start telling her story that day, and I thought, that's ridiculous. She can't understand it. She's, 14 hours old or something. And we realized, as I kept telling the story anyway, because I do what I'm told, we realized that it wasn't for her to hear. Telling the story at that stage was for me to say. It was for me to do all the ins and outs of our story, to find out the parts that were hard for me, to heal those places, and to be able to come to the place by the time she does understand where I love our story, warts and all. Your son, your daughter will have a spidey sense come out whenever they get too close to one of your hot buttons, one of your hurt places that maybe you didn't even know you had, about any of the losses that accompanied your gains. Now, I'm not saying you have to be triggerless. The point is not to be triggerless, but I do encourage you to develop a way of knowing when you're being triggered, so that rather than reacting from that hurt place, kind of like when the doctor hits your knee with that little mallet and you react without thinking, it doesn't even go up to your brain, it just goes to your spinal cord. Instead of reacting from a hurt place, you can pause for a moment and choose how you'd like to respond. For some, that looks like meditation or prayer or a moment of quiet tuning in at the beginning or end of each day, this practice. Meditation can be done in the traditional way, sitting or laying comfortably, but also you can get into the zone through other ways like walking or running or hiking or spending time in nature or doing yoga or cycling or any other ways that work for you to get into your inner space. It's that practice when you're not engaged in parenting that will help you in moments when you are. And your connection to your child is going to be affected by the connection you have to yourself. All right, we're ready to go on to number 3. A commonality that can be found from most, if not all, relationship therapists is this: develop and practice empathy. What this means in parenting through embryo adoption is to make it a practice to try to see things from your child's perspective. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but these are 2 different kinds of dogs. One's a golden retriever and one's a dachshund. And the reason I asked for this slide is because I found many, many years ago an adult adoptee blog where she had this quote that really helped me to try to see from the perspective that my child might have. She said, "It was like 2 golden retrievers adopting a dachshund. They were busy trying to understand why I wasn't a golden retriever. They did their best to help me be a golden retriever. Who can blame them? That's what they knew how to be. They didn't know how to be a short-legged long dog. They wanted to help me overcome my short-legged long dogness, but they were at a loss and they gave up." So what would it feel like to be raised by people with whom you have no genetic connection? Spend some time thinking about that. Would you be curious about those other people and what their home life is like? What about those other kids who look like me living that other life? Would you think about how easily your life could have been completely different? Would you want your parents to be alongside your wanderings with you? Or would you feel as though you needed to keep your thoughts secret so as not to hurt your beloved parents? Now, it's a challenge at the beginning or even in the early stages to tailor our approach to our child because we don't know exactly what we're tailoring to. It takes a while for a child's personality and preferences to emerge. Will they be sensitive or resilient, or both in some combination? Will they be talkative about their conception story as we talk about it over time? Or will they process it more privately and internally? Will they be curious and wonder? Or will they prefer to deal mostly with what's directly in front of them? Or might they have the tendency to stuff things down? Since it may be a while before you know what you're tailoring to, if you have to err on the side of openness, of dealing with what is, because that is ultimately what you'd like to help your son or your daughter do. Number 4, attune to your child. I encourage you then to practice attunement, which is an extension of empathy. And what does this mean? It means we develop the practice of attuning to your child, being gloriously present with him, with the he who he is today, each day. It's practicing being able to see things through his eyes, the way they look now, and now, and now, and all the nows forevermore. There are several ways to attune. I'm going to give you 4 main categories. The first one is having face-to-face interactions. Do things that require face-to-face time. This eliminates watching movies or playing video games together because while you're getting something then, it's not FaceTime. And examples here might be playing a board game or a card game. And a side benefit is that you're building your relationship through fun and play and laughter, which pads your emotional bank account for when you need to draw out non-fun behaviors like homework and chores. Another way would be this. Non-face-to-face time. Driving is great time. Start chats during non-face-to-face time. Driving is a great time to drop pebbles and see if your son or your daughter wants to talk about a tender topic. Regarding embryo adoption, dropping pebbles might sound something like, oh, the Chiefs are playing Chicago this week. I wonder if Jack and Jill or the other parents are rooting for their team. And then you pause and you see if the pebble is picked up. Sometimes the side-by-side positioning that you get in a car can make a sensitive topic seem less threatening without the requirement for eye contact. I find this with my kids a lot, and other people will tell you that happens too. And this seems to become more and more important during the tween and the teen years. A third category of how to attune is to find activities and movement together and make time for activity. Movement is helpful to get flow going within a person and between people. So try an outdoor game like tag or shooting hoops or simply taking walks or whatever type of movement and play bonds you and makes you closer. And lastly is quiet time. Make time for stillness together. My kids are teens, and they still like to cuddle at night at that relaxed time when their defenses are down and closeness is attainable. So this can be story time or reading time or just being together time. This nothing time is like the mortar between the bricks. It's really not nothing. There are many other ways that you can tailor attuning practices to your lives. Be creative and find things that work for you and your family, with the focus being to build connection. Now, attuning also means tuning into ourselves, as we've talked about, working on our own stuff, which means we need a way to know when we have our own stuff coming up, which brings us to number 5. Keep doing work on yourself. Attuning to yourself is so important that we're covering it twice. Be mindful of your own sore spots. We're going to go into this quite in depth. Give your sore spots the care and attention as they come up to be dealt with. So this time let's give some concrete examples of what some sore spots might look like. I'm going to cover the biggies. And the biggest one of all is grief. Now, if you're like me and you had visions when you met your beloved partner of making babies together, his eyes, her hair, our love of this or that, you have filled the crib, but you may still occasionally be reminded of the loss of that specific dream, of your lost, never to be manifested ghost child. And on occasion, you may be reminded by an expression or a preference or a sudden dose of reality that you are not connected in a way you'd like to be to your son or daughter, that you cannot be everything to him or her. You share him or her with another set of parents. And that's rough. That's a rough thing to have as part of your what is. That can hurt. That can feel unfair. The loss of your ghost child, the one you had imagined, sometimes it makes itself felt. How are you going to react or respond when you get such a sudden pang of grief? And will you know that it's happening? Now, there's 3 other emotions we'll cover that stem from grief as their base emotion. Let's take a look at some of the other facets of grief. One of them is jealousy. Maybe it looks like your friends are dealing with kiddos that they get. On Facebook or in real life, they make parenting look easy peasy because they're cut from the same cloth. But you may have times when you just don't feel that. You're raising someone alien to you. Where did this come from? I'm math challenged. I don't know how to deal with gifted math. Or I thought I'd raise an athlete, but instead I'm in music territory and I don't know music. Or I'm a sedate person. I don't know how to deal with such a yearning for motion. Or the opposite of any of those. And at times you may wonder why this is so hard for you and so easy for others. A second way that jealousy can manifest is that for you, there's another couple out there with whom you must, in a way, share the title of parents. That can be a sore spot, a dark spot, where you may feel resentment and jealousy, on occasion, not all the time, about those special ties that you just don't have. And lastly is insecurity. Those other people are out there. That means I'm less than. What if she'd have been better off with someone else? What if I'm messing this up for her? I feel like a fake. This shouldn't be so hard. If you've had any of these fleeting thoughts, you are not alone. They're common and they're normal. But what's dysfunctional is if we squash them down and bury them rather than allowing them to be felt and to pass. Emotions flow when we allow them to. Now, as you can see, these emotions are all tied together, and there are many more that can arise, but these are the basics. And again, the goal is not to never feel these icky emotions. We're going to feel them from time to time because we're human. The goal is to know when we're feeling them, to become our own observer, and to attune to what's going on within ourselves. I'm having trouble here. So when we do this, we can make sure that our below-the-surface emotions don't cause above-the-surface words and actions to erupt from us without our consent or even our awareness. So this awareness takes us from a place of reacting, like with the knee-jerk, to a place of responding, which means we're choosing from a conscious level and not knee-jerking from a subconscious level. All right, we're ready for number 6. For you, the conception and the birth were the happy ending that you'd longed for. For your child, though, those events are just the beginning of their story. So know that what seems like a one-time event for you is going to be a journey or a gradual unveiling to your child over the coming decades. And you want to be on this journey with him or her. I want to give a shout out to a book called Auspicious Adoption by Jim Gritter. I believe it's out of print, but it's something you might be able to get from the library. He uses the hospitality model as an overlay for adoption models, and he talks a lot about what does it take, what makes a good host, and what makes a good guest. And when you want to be a really good host, what are some of the things you do? And when you want to be a good guest, what are some of the things that you do? Because he is saying that adoption is a lot like hosting and guesting. And the adoptive parents are the hosts for the first 18 years, 2 decades, whatever, but gradually they're turning over the hosting duties to the child. And the grown child, we don't even have a word for adult adoptee other than adult adoptee, but that person is going to be the ultimate host, and they will have learned what they know about hosting from their parents. So whatever kind of guest, what you want your guest experience to be in the coming decades, make sure that your hosting duties are in line with that and that you're guided by that sense of kindness and empathy. So we want to talk a little bit more about being aware of your own sore spots, or that was about being more aware of your sore spots. Number 7 is going to be this, keeping your eye on the big picture. Be present so that you can attune, but also keep your eye on the big picture, the long term, which is your child as a well-functioning, identity-integrated adult. Have you noticed during this webinar that I've used your son or daughter more than your child? That's because I'm trying to de-infantilize them. It's so easy for us to get stuck in thinking that they are forever children, but they're not. That's not our goal. Our goal is to raise them to adulthood and independence. Let's also talk about the tendency that we may have to delay with the thought that that's a tough topic, we'll deal with it later. So when we're figuring out how to deliver tricky information to our children about their other parents, other siblings, and other parts of their origin story, yes, it needs to be done in an age-appropriate way in which the information delivered matches the cognitive stage of the son or daughter, and you know that through attuning. But kicking the can down the road doesn't resolve problems, and it often allows them to grow by the time you're ready to deal with them. Then you may have the added problem of your kiddo feeling like he can't trust you to tell him his story. He can't trust you, period. And we need to make sure that we don't miss our windows of timing to tell. Now, the ethicist for the New York Times addressed this in a column last year, taking on the question, should a sibling be told she's adopted? She suspects she's different. The ethicist said, and I'm going to quote here, how do we end up in these binds easily and in a way rationally? Sorites, let me give you this word. Sorites, from the Greek for heap, is the name of a philosophical paradox. A grain of sand is in a heap, and adding one more grain can't make it a heap. And as you add grains of sand, you reason that another grain can't turn your pile into a heap. Yet at some point, a heap is what you have. In the temporal realm, there's an analogous problem. Very often, it won't do any harm to wait one more day to do something, so you put off the deed until, at some point, you've waited too long. Sorites sins can creep up on well-intentioned people. Maybe your wife meant to tell you when you first started dating that she once had a fling with your brother, but the time never seemed right. There was no particular moment when she crossed the line from permissible deferral to culpable silence. A decade later, though, a spiny eel wriggles in her stomach whenever she thinks about it. She prays you never find out. Sorites sins can rock relationships. Now, in case you're curious, the ethicist continues with his response to the question asker about adoption in particular. Your parents had a responsibility to tell your sister the truth, and no doubt they meant to, just not at any specific time. On what day of the calendar does old enough to understand fall? Then, so much time elapsed that they couldn't justify not having told her. The Sorites model helps explain how we can gradually end up in a dire state through inaction. It doesn't, alas, offer solutions, but I can make one general suggestion about the form of procrastination your parents succumb to. If it's unclear when someone is ready to be told something, then the question, may I tell her today, will get you there quicker than must I tell her today. So remember to stay present, but also keep your eyes on the prize, raising a well-adjusted, well-integrated adult with whom you have a healthy and trusting relationship, and to whom you have turned over their entire story. And this means getting the truth out all along the way. All right, we're ready for number 8. Find ways to neutralize the emotional adoption charge that you may feel in certain situations with your child's other parents or with your child himself. Now, before I give you a few examples, let me first tie this in with number 3, which was to see from your child's perspective. You remember the golden rule? It is such a powerful tool for unknotting tricky situations. All it asks is that you try to imagine being in the other's place. It's good advice to occasionally switch places in your imagination with your child's other parents, as well as the child himself. Now, lots of stories and movies have the golden rule as their lesson, showing that a compassionate and less judgmental approach is often the key to getting unstuck. And I highly recommend that you, at some point in the coming weeks, watch Freaky Friday or Brother Bear, 2 really great children's shows where that is exact thing is what helps them get unstuck, is that they trade places. Stephen Covey even had this as one of his habits of highly effective people: seek first to understand and then to be understood. For example, moving this into the embryo adoption arena, there can be a really strong temptation. In fact, I'm told this happens occasionally in embryo adoption, for families to say, no, I am the parent, once they get triggered, and they shut down agreed upon contact out of hurt or anger. This is understandably devastating for the placing families. So when you're struggling with or dealing with a donor parent, ask yourself how you'd manage the same situation with another extended family member with whom you don't have that emotional charge. This is where we're going to reframe to try to remove that emotional charge and figure out what's left in terms of a rational, chosen response. Now, I call this the in-law test or maybe the extended family test. Let me give you a fictional example. So imagine that your teen is about to get on Facebook for the first time under your watchful eye, and imagine that one day your daughter gets on and has a private message from someone who says, "Hi, I'm your sister." Now, if you haven't had discussions with the genetic family about what words you'll use to call your relationships, this could be a trigger, a big trigger. It happens unexpectedly and you're not prepared for it, and it may bring up conversations with your own kiddo that you weren't yet prepared to have. And your reaction, with the little rubber mallet on your knee, may be to get frustrated, angry, and shut down contact, or at least want to. But what would another possible, more considered and less emotional response be? What if it were instead an extended family member who is reaching out saying, "Hi, cuz." Now, without the emotional charge of the adoption there, of the genetic connection or the lack of genetic connection, how would you handle that person? Now, assuming the person really is part of your extended family, you might simply explain to your child how those two are related. You might share your own stories that you have of that person or his parents, and you'd be better able to make a rational decision about, "Hi, cuz," because you aren't emotionally triggered by someone claiming a familial relationship with your child. And here's another example to use the in-law test. An embryo adoption family has done a truly diligent job sharing with the genetic family what's going on. They send details and photos and banter, all presented with care and in an engaging way over time. The responses? Sometimes nothing at all. Sometimes just a one-liner. "Thanks for the newsy letters and pictures." Well, that can seem hurtful. Why so short after all the detail we gave? It's understandable that one would be puzzled or even hurt, and you might want to shut down. Now reimagine. If it were your mother-in-law doing this to you, would you say, "Fine, no more news for you"? You might complain about it under your breath, but you probably wouldn't consider it a breakup offense. You might grin and bear it. You might talk with her about your feelings on her lack of acknowledgement and appreciation, but you probably wouldn't go straight to cutting her out. So the in-law test is a way for you to reframe so that you can take away the emotional charge and arrive at a rational response that best serves your family, not an emotional reaction that comes from a hurt and triggered place. And here's a different kind of example of removing the adoption charge. This is another kind of emotion. This one comes from dealing with disparities in contact between two of your kiddos, in cases in which your kids have different genetic parents. Now, at first, you might be completely befuddled by how to resolve the fact that one kiddo has very responsive other parents and the other has absent other parents. I mean, to make things fair, do you figure out a way to up the involvement of the absent ones, or do you reduce the contact for the other child? I mean, the inequality just seems so wrong, and a path through seems impossible. So let's instead imagine a different situation in inequality, one that has no adoption charge. Let's imagine instead that our two kids have a difference in math abilities. And let's remember this one as the math test. So what would you do? You have one child who is identified as gifted in math and is going to take accelerated math, and the other one who is not. My guess is that what you do in that situation would not be to hold back the advanced one or push forward the not advanced one. You would meet each child where they are. You would support the child going through advanced math in meeting those challenges, and you would abide with the one who may have emotions about not being advanced. You'd sit there and abide with them. You'd support them where they are with math. You'd support their emotions around it. And you wouldn't try to protect them from the sadness. You'd allow them to feel the sadness, because that's what parents do. We want to prepare them for dealing with such emotions. So do you see how we can make rational decisions when we imagine a similar situation without the emotional adoption charge? It just takes a little bit of reframing to help us get to an out-of-the-box solution. And our last one, allow your kiddo the fluidity to process their embryo adoption story over time. Just because today doesn't mean tomorrow. In other words, don't lock your son or daughter into one way. Oh, he's not the curious sort, or, oh, she's never asked about it. Understand that things can change for him or her over the years, and allow room for them to wonder and roam about their story. Also, stay attuned so that you know if something has shifted in your child's processing of their story. Again, the dropping pebbles technique can be helpful over time. Now, here's one account of an embryo adoption family, both sets of parents who did a fantastic job at allowing their son some fluidity. This is their quote. When he was younger, our son was really excited about the idea of seeing his genetic parents. They had last met when he was 2. He loved looking at pictures and reading letters from them beforehand, and things looked really positive. But the meeting got postponed indefinitely due to a car wreck. Everyone turned out okay. As our son got older, his interest receded. He vocalized some concerns about meeting his genetic parents because we were his parents. We were open with the donors about his concerns, and they have been so supportive throughout. The donor family eventually asked if our son would be okay with emailing directly, which eased him into things and made him feel more comfortable. That went on for 6 or 7 emails back and forth, and then he lost interest in emailing. But that bridge offered the encouragement he needed to again want to meet them. His genetic family has never pushed him to go beyond his comfort level. The bottom line is that we all meet him wherever he is. So what he or she doesn't want to think about at one stage may be completely different in another, and you want to be attuned and receptive if and when your child pivots. Similarly, don't expect your child to have the same relationship with their adoption that others you know have of theirs. People may come into this with an assumption like, well, my best friend was adopted and it was closed and she's fine, so our child will be fine also with closedness. Each era and each person and each situation is unique. Your child deserves to find their own way and have their own preferences honored as they emerge and change. So let's take a quick look once more through those 9 steps. Number 1, know that parenting will stretch you, and you just have an added layer of it with the embryo adoption piece. Number 2, tune into yourself and make doing so a practice. Number 3, see from your child's perspective and make doing so a practice. Number 4, attune to your child and make doing so a practice. Number 5, attune to yourself and make doing so a practice. Number 6, see your son's or your daughter's origin story as a journey, not a point in time. Number 7, keep your eye on the big picture of raising a healthy, functioning, and well-integrated adult. Number 8, reframe and neutralize the adoption charge to gain clarity. And number 9, allow your son or daughter the fluidity to process over time. Adoption creates a split between a person's biology and her biography. Openness is an effective way to help heal that split. That's the premise in the book, and that's how we heal in adoption, with this both and heart set. Right speech, right action, and right response, not reaction, flows from that. And Deb, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lori. That was fantastic. I just want to go ahead and open up the floor for any questions that anybody has after listening through that. I already saw that a couple came in. So this would be how you would submit questions. You would just click on the lower right-hand corner of the screen, type your question in, and go ahead and send it. And while you are working on sending questions in, Lori, if you could switch it to the next screen, I do want to let you know about some future events. So a little bit later in the month, on Wednesday, May 31st, we are going to be doing a Facebook Live video in the evening. I know that's oftentimes a lot easier for families when they're at home, when they're have a little bit more time outside of work to be able to learn about embryo donation and adoption. So we'll be on Facebook Live. You can join in, hear some of the top questions that families often have about embryo donation and adoption. We'd love to have you join us then. And then next month, on Wednesday, June 7th, we're going to be creating or rehashing an older webinar, creating a family profile for embryo adoption. We thought it was a good time to update it and add some extra things in. So your family profile, when you're considering embryo adoption, is one of your first and best opportunities to introduce yourself to a placing family. So we just want to go through what makes a family profile good and how to really gain the attention of placing families as well. So we'd love to have you join for either of those, and also check out Pathway to Family. It is a magazine and a resource that you can read through for stories about embryo adoption, families that have been there, done that, and also just great tips along the way. So if you want to check that out, you can go to pathwaytofamily.com. I do see some questions coming in. Hold on, let me see if I can view them a little bit better. Okay, so the first question I have is, how do you start? And I'm assuming she's talking about her story. So how do you start? I struggle to know how to tell the story. It has not been something that has been discussed, and their daughter is now 3. They have a biological child who was a surprise. I just lost that question, sorry. Oh, which was a surprise. So she feels paralyzed, she says.
I think the first thing to do behind the scenes would be to figure out where your own fears are. What are you worried about happening? What's the worst thing that could happen? Where are the places that you're trying to avoid? And you'll find a lot of answers onto what your own triggers are in this. So that's the first part. The second part is I would probably start with something like, you know, you and your sister, I don't know if that's a sister or brother, but you and your sister have different stories. And I'd like to tell you yours. Would you like to hear it? And then if you get that permission, you would say, well, with your sister, this is how babies are made. You keep it really basic at the age of 3. And with you, we needed a little bit of help, and so other people came to help us create you and grow you. And you just keep it very, very basic, and then let her lead you where she's ready to go, what questions come out of that.
Absolutely. She also had a kind of a follow-up question as well. She said, I struggle how to conceptualize daughter's genetic parents. Others have spoken about how they are not your child's parents and have no connection that way because they're not parenting the child themselves. So how would you refer to them? I think specifically that advice for what to call them.
Well, the people who are saying that they're not your child's parents and have no connection, I think are looking at from the parent's perspective and maybe not the child's. the child is likely to feel like they do have some sort of a connection to the person who they got all of the DNA and all of their cells from. So there is a connection, and the first step would be to acknowledge that there is a connection. And you can, maybe you, Deb, can come up with some of those terms that embryo adoption families are using for genetic parents or donor parents, and ways to explain what that particular unique relationship is.
Yeah, I've often heard families just referring to them either as genetic parents or biological parents, or even just by name. If they don't necessarily need, so they might have that discussion and say, hey, these are genetic parents, and just explain the story of how that came about, and then oftentimes they would just refer to them by first name. That also helps a little bit more if you're not in an anonymous donation, because you might not have a name. So sometimes it's just working in your family to see what seems to work and how to refer to them. But a lot of times I do hear just them referring to them as genetic parents or genetic family.
Yeah, we can, and sometimes in adoption, including embryo adoption, we get into biology a lot and genetics a lot earlier than other kids get into this, because it comes up. And the more comfortable we can be with the story, the easier it's going to be to tell.
Absolutely. Okay, so another question came in. What resources do you recommend that provide guidance of age-appropriate openness and communication?
In the realm of traditional adoption, I know that Gail Swift, I think her website is gailhswift.com. She does a lot of book reviews about children's books about adoption and adult books about adoption, and that's probably where I would start to go about how to have, specifically how to have these talks and what ages are appropriate. She probably has something on her site.
Absolutely, yeah, and we also have a couple webinars. I can include it in the follow-up email I'm sending out that are specifically about how to tell the child about embryo adoption, and it even addresses different age groups and how to start that discussion with them. So I can send that in a follow-up as well, so you have resources for that. Okay, and then we have somebody that had to kind of jump in and out while they're at work, but she asked if you can, she wanted to know if you suggested an age to start the discussions with children.
I'll say what our agency told us, and the day you bring them home. If that has already passed, then today.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. All right, so I have another question that came in, and you can answer it to the best of your ability, Lori. Oh, I lost it again. All of this is interesting, certainly, but what are some suggestions you have for anonymous embryo donation? Some of the questions that kids ask, we don't have answers for. How do you recommend handling that? So it would be similar to just traditional adoption where there's a closed placement as well, Lori.
Yeah, and I answered this extensively on my website. I have, at lavenderluz.com, I have a whole tab devoted to open adoption advice, and somebody did ask, what do you do when you don't have birth parent information? Sometimes it's common not to even know, to have an unknown birth father. And the basic gist of that is to share what you do know and say what you don't know. So the point isn't to deliver the information. That's secondary to building trust with your kid. So you let them know that everything you know you are telling them, and that if they want to go searching somehow through DNA databases or something, this would be of course later on, that you will be alongside them if that's something they want. There are new technologies and ways to find out gene pool information, and but basically you share what you do know, and you let them know that we don't know this, but if you decide some point you want to try to pursue that, we will help you. We will be alongside you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This one I might have to answer a little bit, but one of the questions, do children adopted as embryos have an easier time bonding to their adopted parents than children who are adopted as infants or young children, or is the bonding struggle similar? I can answer just from talking to embryo adopted families that have adopted embryos, and just kind of talking to them as they're raising children. I do believe that bonding is easier when you're have adopted an embryo because you are carrying the pregnancy, giving birth to the baby, nursing, all of those types of things are included with embryo adoption. So the bonding part of the process is a lot easier. It's still just as important, of course, to talk to them about how they came to you, but the bonding, as long as those two components are in, of course, you carry the pregnancy, you have bonding there, and then there's added trust as well if you're telling them just upfront about their story. So I've seen that go really well for Snowflake's families specifically. Do you have anything to add to that, Lori, or was that good?
No, I would agree with that totally.
Okay.
I agree.
Then I have another question. How would I know the right time to introduce my child to their donor family?
A lot of this is attuning. And if you take the extended family model and replace it with how would I know the right time to introduce my child to their grandmother, maybe that will help you decide. If I'm of the mind that if you do it from early on, then there's less kind of zipping up of of something that's been spread apart, that it just kind of stays integrated if you build it in as early as possible. The bigger deal you make it, the bigger deal it is for the kid, kind of.
Absolutely. Okay. Then I have another question, too. I think you can help with this one. So she's saying, my son is 2.5, conceived via donor sperm and egg. I've not been open with many about the donor egg. My own dad doesn't know about the situation either. Oh, I'm sorry, I lost the question right in the middle.
I've got it here. Should I reverse that and just tell everyone? I plan for my son to know, so maybe I should just be open now. This is such a great question because this highlights the difference between secrecy and privacy. And we did a whole webinar on this. Maybe we can figure out we can send out a link to that, Deb, because you want to turn the story over to your child, but you are not under obligation to turn it over to anybody else. Well, some people need to know, and you have to kind of figure out who's on a need-to-know basis. But the difference, you're not going to treat your child the same as you treat everybody else. You are going to turn it over to your child, and you're going to be judicious about what else you say to other people. And we'll send out the link to the webinar that we've done specifically on that issue.
Absolutely, yes. Okay. There's a couple people that the webinar started a little bit early for them, so yes, we are going to send out the recording to anybody. If you missed the beginning of it, you will be able to watch it. I'll be sending out a recording of that. There's another question about at what age, which we answered. Oh, somebody asked if you could repeat Gail's last name.
Gail Swift. I think her, and let me spell it for you because it's G-A-Y-L-E, and H is her middle initial, and Swift, SWIFT.com. Perfect.
I have a lot of questions coming in. How do you manage how others talk with your child about their story and the impact of their views on her story? I had a caregiver say to me, oh yes, you are not her parents, when they asked me about how I was a child and if my daughter got it from her. Basically, I would say a trait from her.
Well, you pull that caregiver aside and make sure she knows that there are no fake parents in this place. We are all real. Your child just happens to have a more complicated story than she may be used to, than the caregiver may be used to. And you kind of become an ambassador for this for people who know. And you need to educate her and let her know, yeah, I am a real parent. I'm not the genetic parent, but I am a real parent. And then you may also just say, for matters like this, and I'd like you to let me navigate this with my child instead of you kind of getting involved in this. I would set a heavy boundary against that with the education, not as a mean way, but as a this is not your place way.
Absolutely. Okay, we have another question coming in. My son's sperm donor is open for contact when their child is 18, but the egg donor is completely anonymous. She regrets that decision now, but it's too late for to change that, obviously. Do you see any issues with that?
Not at all.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I don't see any issues with that at all. We kind of already talked about if one or both donors are not available or not known, you deal with what you do have and you acknowledge what you don't have. It's the most important thing is to deliver truth.
Absolutely. And we also do have, again, another webinar on anonymous donors, because that does come up in embryo adoption quite often. So we have a social worker, Chris Brobasco, that went through what can be done even when there is an anonymous donor to help get your child information. Sometimes that's just so that you do the researching and put that in a file for if they ask for it later. Sometimes that is, if they're already asking questions, you can help them along with it. So I will include all of the resources that we're mentioning in the follow-up email so that you can have access to it.
These are great questions. What a fabulous group we've had today.
Absolutely. Okay, so I have another question coming in. As a man, what is the best way for the father to bond to the son or daughter?
All right, I have a resource on this one, and I'll get it to you, Deb, so you can get it out to everybody. But creatingafamily.com, Dawn Davenport there did an interview with Dr. Karen Purvis, and her name is spelled Karyn Purvis. She did a radio interview with her about things to do when you first meet your child. And this is more about a child coming out of foster care, but I think some of the things there will be really, Dr. Karen Purvis was an expert in attachment bonding, and I think that's the essence of this question. So lots of eye contact, skin-to-skin contact, meeting, just making sure needs are met, and that you're attuning, that you're really, really just attuning and feeling what that baby child is feeling, and knowing what they're going through, what things might look like for them at that moment.
Perfect. Okay, and another one. I've noticed recently that many children's movies, such as Annie, have orphans or displaced children. She also said Tarzan and Tangled in them. Do you think these stories are helpful or harmful to adopted children?
That's a really great question. I have another fabulous resource. Addison Cooper writes at adoptionatthemovies.com. I think his actual website is adoptionlcsw.com, but we'll send that out. And he goes over a lot of movies that are about adoption or have adoption elements in them, and he alerts parents on what to look for. And he also gives some discussion questions that you might want to do. And he has a book out too, also called Adoption at the Movies. So that would be a good resource. But also, I think overall, it can be helpful if you're attuned with your child and you know the movie. It can be a really good way to drop those pebbles and find out what your child is ready to talk about as you watch those movies together. And you can say, what do you think that was like to grow up without his mom or something like that? And then you can let them pick it up and take it where they want to, where they're ready to.
Absolutely. And we're going just at the hour when we were supposed to be done. So I'm going to take maybe 2 more questions. Would that be enough, Lori?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a friend knows our story but keeps asking in front of others, who do we think our twins look like? They look like
I would pull that friend aside again and say, hey, lay off. If they know the story, why are they asking? Is there something else going on there?
It doesn't say.
Yeah.
It just says that they know that they're adopted and keep asking about it.
It sounds like maybe there's something else going on, and I think I would privately ask that person, hey, do you know what the impact that is on me and my child when you ask that? I know you don't want to hurt us, but so let me explain it to you. And then I would say, when you ask this, it kind of brings us into a place publicly where we would prefer to go privately.
Absolutely. Okay, and then I see another one. I'll just have this be the last one. So she said, I apologize if this was already asked, but how necessary is it to be open about embryo adoption with 1 extended family, 2 close friends, or 3 acquaintances?
And that I'm going to refer you again to the other webinar that's available on privacy versus secrecy, because we talk about the concentric circles, and who's at the core need to know and how those circles go outside and how you might handle it at each of those rings.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think some of the questions that we haven't gotten to are really focused on that, so I'll make sure that all of those resources are included with the follow-up email. But I think that is enough for today. It's 11:02 for us, so I'm going to go ahead and let everybody go today, get back to work or whatever else is going on. And thank you so much, Lori. I really appreciate you joining us again. As always, it was fantastic to have you, and you always do a wonderful job.
Thank you, Deb. It's a pleasure.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.